So good evening to everybody and welcome to this fifth event of our cycle Voices on Contemporary Philosophy, which is organized and promoted by our curriculum in philosophy, as you all know at this point, actually. And today it is a great pleasure for us to welcome Professor Lea Ypi from the London School of Economics. And we are very glad to have the opportunity to listen to her and to discuss with her today and tomorrow morning. And, well, of course, Lea Ypi is a leading political theorist, but she is also a best-selling novelist at this point of her life. And so what makes her research so interesting to me is the fact that she always pays a lot of attention to the intertwining between political theorization and even normative theory on the one hand, and political events and historical reality and the historical development on the other. And as a matter of fact, this attention is very well attested to by the topic she has proposed for this lecture, that is, what is political progress? And I'm sure she will provide us with some critical and illuminating insights into this relationship between theory and praxis, or philosophy and history. So thank you warmly for being with us today and for having accepted our invitation. And let me also thank Professor Olivia Guaraldo from the University of Verona. She is a full professor of political philosophy there. And Elisa Piras from the Eurach Institute in Bolzano. Elisa translated several works by Lea Ypi into Italian, and she will now tell us something more about these works. Let me just remind that next week we will have another leading voice of the contemporary philosophy with us, that is Axel Honneth. And after him, it will be Julie Revel from Paris Nanterre who will close the cycle. So now, Elisa, you can take the floor. Thank you very much and enjoy.
Does that work? Okay. So thank you very much, Tiziana, Professor Nicoletti, for inviting me. I'm very glad to and somehow excited to be here and to have the pleasure and the honor to introduce you Lea Ypi. She's a professor in political theory at the LSE in London, an adjunct professor at the Australian National University in Canberra. She did her PhD and her BA in Italy. So she graduated from the University La Sapienza in Rome, and then she did her PhD at the European University Institute. And after that, she went to Oxford and then London. But in the meanwhile, she also had visiting positions in several prestigious research institutes in Europe and in Australia. And in the meanwhile, she wrote an impressive amount of essays and books, and also some edited books. I would just like to give you an overview of the journals where she has been publishing during this year: Philosophy and Public Affairs, Ethics and International Affairs, Political Theory, Kantian Review, and the European Journal of Philosophy, and these are really a minor amount. So she entered the debate about global justice since when she studied as a PhD student and did her first steps in research. And in 2011, she published a book, Global Justice and Avant-Garde Political Agency, which I think we will probably refer to later. And her idea was to enter this debate, which can be sometimes a bit involute, I would say, and twisted, and to propose an account of global justice which was inspired by cosmopolitan political and moral principles and found a middle way to accommodate some of the reasons for supporting statist projects, especially the issue of motivation and of stimulating agency. So she wrote on several global justice related issues, for instance, colonialism and progress in history, but also migration and political theory. And she wrote also about important concepts in political philosophy, such as partisanship. The most recent book published by Oxford University Press concerns the architectonic of reason, a crucial, neglected, sometimes scaring part, I would say, of the critique of pure reason. And Lea looked at it very thorough, I would say, establishing links between Kant's philosophy and the philosophy of other authors of his time, and also finding a way to argue that purposiveness is the key to enter the mystery of the architectonic of reason. So as you will see, Lea combines a thorough knowledge and I would say a brilliant interpretation of philosophical contemporary discourse from the Anglo-Saxon debate, especially on global justice and Kantianism, but also on Marxism, and a solid and I would say illuminating basis of the reading of the text of the history of political thought. When we met the first time, I remember one of the first things that I told her was that I really admired Ismail Kadare, an Albanian author. And as Tiziana said, now Lea became a best-selling author, so I have two, at least, Albanian authors that I admire. So I would like now to leave her the floor, and I wish you all a good time with Lea's relation, which is about a crucial question. So what is political progress? Lea.
Thank you very much, Elisa, for this introduction, and thank you very much to everyone for being here. It's always a great pleasure and also personally such a delight to come back to Italy and to go back to Italian universities and address audiences. I remember somewhat halls like these from the years in which I was studying here and I was sitting on the other side. And so there's always a touch of emotional when I come back and sort of re-enter the rooms, and it's as though I re-entered a period of my life that I'm very fond of, but that I think is also has been also crucial to me and for my intellectual upbringing. So I'm always very, very grateful for the opportunity to revisit both the conversations and the sites. So I always start the presentations these days with a caveat, and in part because I now have this double life also as an author and a literary author, and sometimes I know there are people in the room who come for the literary side. And so I always have to start with a warning that this is actually not that, and it's a philosophical paper, and it gets a little bit technical in points. So, you know, feel free to leave the room if you've come for something different, for more literature or more plot and more character and so on. But the concerns are actually always the same in my work, and I was very grateful to Elisa for bringing them up. So the topic of the paper is political progress, and progress is both a necessary and a dangerous idea. It's necessary if we're trying to improve the way things are and to look to the future and to motivate our moral actions and to think that when we need to do the right thing, to look at the injustices in the world with some sense of hope that it is possible to remedy these injustices. But it's also a dangerous idea because we know that narratives of progress and the justifications for such narratives have led often to writing brutal histories in the recounting the experiences of Europeans going to other parts of the world and lecturing about emancipating barbarians and bringing European civilization to people who weren't thought of as capable enough to articulate such conceptions of progress and reason. And so often the concept of progress, and in fact these days more often the concept of progress, is associated to this dark history of the abuses of it and the misuses of it, and to narratives of colonial domination or paternalism or, as I say, civilizational superiority. So I think on the one hand it's necessary, I think, to defend the idea of progress. On the other hand, it's important to defend it in the right way and to offer an account of progress that is critical and that is offered in a spirit of critical awareness of this dark history of the uses and abuses of the concept of progress. And that's partly where what I'm working on right now with my philosopher's hat on, and that's what I would like to try and articulate today and to begin to offer an account of what a critical theory of progress might look like. And I want to suggest in my paper that we make progress not when we approximate an ideal that is always and already known to us, but when the political institutions that we construct reflect what we know and what we learn from the failures of the past, including the failures to bring progress and to realize progress. And in what I'm going to do in the next 45 minutes or so is to try and articulate that account of progress. So I'm going to start with two questions. First of all, what does it mean to say or to believe in progress? What does this postulate of progress mean? And I think to answer that question, it helps to situate the status of this postulate of progress within two kind of epistemic possibilities. The first one is to say that progress is not impossible. And I think that's plausible, but it's almost trivial to say that progress is not impossible, because the position seems to become strong and to gain its strength because of the weakness of the alternative. And what does the alternative statement say? It says, well, progress is impossible. And I think that commits us to a kind of prophetic theorizing about the future, where the person who says progress is impossible claims to know how future events will unfold. And so it's a form of theorizing that claims to predict the future course of events without really supplying any proof on behalf of that statement. So we want to say something a little bit more than just progress is not impossible. And the second extreme statement is the opposite, is to say that progress is necessary and that the belief in progress is a necessary belief. And while the first claim is too strong, I think this one is also strong, because in arguing the case, one seems to misunderstand the kind of agent that is responsible for thinking and for making progress in history compatibly with moral ends. And I think the philosopher that goes further in the direction of explaining what is entailed in making that kind of statement about progress, Immanuel Kant, says that that kind of attitude towards the future only makes sense as a mode of prophetic theorizing only when the prophet contrives and realizes the events that they foresee and that they anticipate. And that's why agency is crucial to that account of progress, because what we're saying is that if we're prophetically assuming that progress is necessary, what we're saying is that the prophet, the human being, can indeed act in such a way that they bring about the events that they are telling, that they're anticipating, that they're foreshadowing. And so, and Kant says that statement would only make sense if we could attribute to human beings an inherently good will. If we knew that they know what the right thing to do is, they know what morality calls for, and they go ahead and do what morality calls for with this pureness and goodness of the will that unfortunately we also know that we can't rely on human beings to have, because humans, although they have a good motive, as Kant would say, they also have an evil motive that drives them forward. And so human beings aren't exclusively moral, and the motives that drive their actions forward are mixed, and so it's very difficult to know in advance from circumstances like those ones what exactly will happen. So to say that we believe in progress, and to say when we need a theory of progress what that theory entails, is to say a little bit more that progress is not impossible, and a little bit less than progress is necessary. So what I'm going to try and articulate is exactly, and I think that's what a kind of theory of progress, a critical theory of progress, requires, is to articulate an account of progress that is situated between those two extremes, and to focus on moral agency as it expresses itself in the course of human history by thinking about the political and social institutions as they promote or hinder this kind of moral agency. So we want to be able to explore history from a philosophical perspective as if we were looking at it as a meaningful whole in which we can actually detect some kind of direction, and we can say what is it that requires us and makes us move in that direction, and to look at those motives in history as if they were integrated, not just in a chaotic ordering as we find them in normal history, but when we look at them from a philosophical history perspective, we think of them as a normatively integrated whole. So we're able to find the kind of moral force that is behind all this chaotic, incoordinate mixture of events. So what I try and do in this paper and in this research on this critical account of progress is to articulate this conception of progress in connection to a development in our theories of justice and in the way in which we think about justice. And I'm going to explain in a minute why I think justice is important and why it's particularly connected to the question of political progress. But basically what I'm going to suggest is that we can defend a critical theory of progress if we think of justice as a kind of normative property that is subject to a functional refinement. And I will try to explain a little bit what I mean by function statements, how they connect to moral theory, and to suggest that we make progress in the norms of justice as a result of a cumulative process of refinement of the function of justice, through which principles of justice inform normative views around how power should be exercised, by who and with what means. And I'm going to, towards the second half of the paper, explore some of the methodological criteria that I think are connected to making these judgments around a better or worse use of justice. And I will refer a little bit to some of my work on global justice, in which I apply this methodology in a much more narrow framework of debates around the function of the state. So, but first of all, I think to explain what political progress means, we need to start by distinguishing between progress and political progress, and therefore between political progress and moral progress. So the idea that human beings might make moral progress in the course of attempting to solve problems, which is basically where this critical theory of progress is based on, is familiar from philosophical literature, in particular connected to developments in pragmatist philosophy, where the idea is that we can defend a moral theory of progress as a result of processes of functional refinement. And what I'm going to do, I will start with that analysis of moral progress in pragmatic philosophical literature to try and articulate how political progress is both connected but also different from moral progress, and to articulate an account of political progress that depends on the refinement of justice-based norms. So let me start with the idea of moral progress, and then we can illustrate the parallels and the differences between political progress and moral progress. So one way of making sense of the notion of moral progress is to appeal to teleological assumptions about the onwards march of human agents throughout history. And although I have a lot of sympathy and a lot of time for teleological accounts and things that they're generally dismissed very quickly without really engaging and understanding properly what they mean, for now I will just go with that kind of caricature version and say that I'm not going to kind of get into more detailed discussion of teleology. But I think that in part those who criticize these moral accounts of progress and the teleological drive behind these moral accounts of progress, usually it's because they associate those accounts precisely with the kind of dangerously paternalistic drive that I was just describing and that I started with at the beginning. And so I'm not going to discuss that too much. Another way in which theories of philosophical theories have developed accounts of moral progress is by thinking about moral progress as a process of functional refinement of moral norms. And here the connection is to function statements and the way in which function statements appear in the philosophy of biology, where it's commonplace to discuss the development of particular organs by thinking about their contribution to the performance of a particular function. So one of the examples is human beings in biology. They say human beings have hearts so that the hearts can pump blood. So that's a kind of function statement. And a function is described as a property or a set of properties that explains the existence and preservation of particular traits in a given population via evolutionary mechanisms. And so on this account, the function of ethics is to remedy altruism failures, and the story about progress is that a body of moral norms is considered to be progressive if it contributes to the process of functional refinement of these codes of conduct and normative principles that help remedy altruism failures, and in a way that is solid across cultural and temporal variations. And of course, there's a lot of criticisms to the way in which function statements are applied in ethics, but I'm not going to, again, go into the general critique of function statements in ethics, because what I'm trying to do is to adopt that framework of thinking about functional refinement and to specifically zoom in on what makes political progress a distinctive, although related, idea of inquiry to moral progress, and to try and explain what could be the function and what could be the functional refinement that we would be looking at if we were to think about not the general question of moral progress, but the specific question of political progress. And on that note, I think it helps to start with thinking about what does political philosophy and the discussion around political progress contribute to discussions around moral philosophy and moral progress, and what makes politics a distinctive realm of human interaction compared to the moral interpersonal realm of moral norms and exchange of moral norms and solidifying moral norms. And I think what makes the questions that politics raises distinctive from the questions that moral theory raises are two. One is the question of coordination, and the other one is the question of continuity. So the question of coordination is one that says that even if I assume that when I do the right thing from a moral perspective, I'm following, I don't know, the categorical imperative according to Kant or some other principle according to some other philosophical framework, what is it that guarantees that everyone else will also follow these moral principles? So I can do this as a moral agent, and I'm motivated to do the right thing as a moral agent, but I lack the assurance that other people will also be similarly motivated. And therefore I lack the assurance that my moral efforts will be integrated into a moral whole where other people are doing their share just as I am doing my share. So that's the first problem, which is a problem of coordination, which to some extent politics raises and has always raised as an additional concern to if we're just examining interpersonal relations from this from a purely moral perspective. The second one has to do with what I call the problem of continuity. And that means that even if I assume that the problem of coordination is resolved, and so that I do the right thing and other people do the right thing, and our efforts are coordinated and morally integrated, there is a question of how do we make sure that the norms that we have constructed will stay there throughout time for the future generation, and so will remain stable and consistent and reliable across time. And that is, I think, again, the problem of continuity, which we can only resolve if we think about the function of law and justice and political institutions as connected to those functions. So I think the familiar story, and again, I don't think this is particularly new or interesting thing to say, but basically if we look at the history of political philosophy, it's a very familiar story whereby all the classics of political philosophy raise this very question. First of all, how do human beings coordinate their moral efforts into a kind of integral, interpersonal whole? And the second one is, how do institutions preserve these mechanisms of coordination throughout time? And they do so because political institutions exercise some kind of collective authority that ensure, on the one hand, mechanisms of coordination, and on the other hand, mechanisms of continuity in the form of constitutions, legal systems, institutions, and so on. So, and they, of course, further say that the way in which we can guarantee the development and the reliable condition for these human practices to be sustained across time is if we combine a system of sanctions on the one hand, and then the development of human practices, norms, mores, and so on the other, which again we can do through the use of power. And so the exercise of political power is basically what is assumed to be necessary to overcome the limits of these altruistic norms and dispositions and the individual way in which we relate to these norms and dispositions, even if we concede that these norms and dispositions are essential to recognize why we need power. So, and of course, the generation and the replication of political rule through the exercise of power is different from the generation of moral norms through these voluntary efforts. And that's what makes political philosophy a distinctive realm of inquiry from moral philosophy, and that's what makes the question of the political somewhat distinctive from the question of just the moral and what is the right thing that I should do. So, and this is where I come to my refinement or rethinking functional statements, and in this more pragmatic, philosophically pragmatic way, if we think about moral progress as a kind of progress that is captured by the functional refinement of altruistic dispositions in remedying altruistic failures, it might be plausible, or at least this is my suggestion, to think of political progress as the analog to the idea of moral progress, whereby we think of justice as the concept that is subject to functional refinement. Okay, so now I'm going to say a few things about why justice, and how does justice enable this resolving of the coordination problem and the continuation problems. Justice, we often say, is the first virtue of social institutions, and you all know, because you've probably read, or maybe you haven't read Rawls, the theory of justice. And of course the question is, has justice always been that, or is it a kind of to arbitrarily pick and select and think of justice as the first virtue of social institutions? I think it has more to do with a kind of historically contingent assessment of how we think when we address political institutions, and how we think of when subjects make claims on the states or on the international system. We see that these claims are often made in the name of justice and in the names of rights. So norms of justice in the interpersonal, in the political interpersonal realm seem to play an equivalent role to what moral norms play in the interpersonal realm. Moral norms tend to establish how we relate to each other, and justice-based norms are required in a context where moral norms are not enough robust or enough sufficient to guarantee that we can uphold this coordinated and continuous just interaction, and where some form of collective authority is required to ensure that we can create and maintain political control through the reproduction of power-generating mechanisms. So if the function of ethics is to remedy altruist failures, the function of justice is to regulate the use of power in context of conflict between different political agents, because of the two problems of coordination and continuity that I just mentioned. So if we think of ethical progress as a process of ethical refinement involving the emergence and consolidation of more and more morally appropriate norms, we can think of political progress as a process of refinement of justice-based norms. And that is to say, we're saying that in the course of cooperating to solve political problems, human beings come up with principles and with schemes for regulating human conduct that is more or less adequate to respond to this problem of power. And the nature of the problem, of course, depends on the different points in time and depends on historically specific account of how institutions operate and how power is exercised within them and to who and through what means. But I think it's plausible to say that in the course of coping with the political problem, human beings come up with different interpretations of what power is, who can exercise it, with what reasons, and for what means. And I think, again, all the kind of classical texts in political theory start with that question and try to answer that question. And then you have the answer, you know, is it oligarchy, is it aristocracy, which type of regime is the best one to respond to this, and so on. So what does it mean to speak of a process of functional refinement of the norms of justice? One way is, I think, to think of the process of developing these justice-based norms in their relationship to power and in the account that is given to how power relates to the subjects over whom power is exercised as a kind of process of discovery of more or less appropriate types of political institutions. And we don't need to think of this process as one that is always driven by reason giving and by morality and by forms of altruistic concerns, because if we were to assume that, then in some ways politics wouldn't be needed. People would always be moral and morality would be enough. And we also don't have to think of that process as a kind of linear process that occurs without ever any relapses back in the future. So once an appropriate mechanism of relating to power or morally justified mechanism of relating to power has been discovered or has been institutionalized, there is no guarantee that there will be no going backwards and that we will lose that mechanism at some point. And I think it's a slightly more complicated question. There will be a memory of it, but we may lose it from a political point of view. So the emergence of different principles of justice and the plurality of schemes on the basis of which this relationship to power is regulated by individuals could be determined by a whole range of factors historically. So it could be about the brutal imposition of a coercive system of rules on the side of a very powerful elite. It could be kind of sheer mechanisms of exploitation and a combination of sanction and punishment. It could be combination of intellectual work and political struggle. It could be that some moral norms at some point become recognized generally and gain traction and therefore make their entry in the political sphere. So the genealogy of the different forms of rule is varied, but the point of reflecting on political progress as a process of refinement of these justice-based norms is that we can then use a critical genealogy of existing forms of rules that is therefore helpful to continue to further develop whatever has worked or we think has worked in the past, and to learn from the failures and the trials of the past, and to improve these mechanisms when we think about our relationship to political authorities in the future. So I think, what I try to do in my first book, which is called Global Justice and Avant-Garde Political Agency, was to basically apply something like this method to a much more specific question and set of concerns, which was the global justice debate. And the global justice debate was a very specific debate that took a very specific form, most of which rotated around the question, is the state ethically defensible or is the state ethically indefensible? And should the scope of equality be extended beyond the state as cosmopolitans maintained, or should equality be restricted to the mechanisms of the nation state within which other statists, Thomas Nagel, for example, other philosophers, or even John Rawls in The Law of Peoples, tries to kind of contain it. And what I try to do in that work is to reflect on something like this process, although I hadn't at that point got quite to the discussion around political progress and to the discussion around functional refinement of norms of justice and so on, but was to try and come up with a set of criteria through which one could see how these two very different theories related to the kinds of conflicts of the present that they were trying to resolve. And so you had the statists on the one hand and the cosmopolitans on the other, both of which were grappling with the politics of globalization, to put it crudely, and with the huge inequalities and injustices, the huge poverties of the world in which we lived, and where I was trying to think about which of these theories fares better than the others when it comes to just understanding what this process is and understanding the kinds of challenges of globalization. And when I developed that method, and when I was looking at that particular debate, I came up with 3 ways in which one could examine, from a methodological perspective, different theories, and one could look at how these theories accounted for both the empirical struggles of the world, but also the kinds of normative principles that would be developed out of these empirical struggles to try and orient then thinking in the world. And so it was a method of thinking, a kind of heuristic method of thinking about how these different theories compare to each other, that was inspired by debates in the philosophy of science, in particular the work of Lakatos and so on, which try to refer to fallibilism in theories of development of science and challenges to scientific paradigms and questions around scientific progress. And I felt that by looking at these debates in the philosophy of science, one could develop a similar way of developing fallibilistic methods, but applied to social science and to the realm of social interactions rather than to hard science and to laws of nature and so on. But the debate was very similar because it started again with a paradigm and thinking about where is the crack in the paradigm and thinking about what criteria do we have to compare these different paradigms and so on. And I came up, again, inspired especially by the work of Lakatos, with these 3 ways in which I felt that you could compare one set of theories to another set of theories, which was that you needed 3 criteria, which I labeled diagnostic, innovating, and heuristic. I'll say something very quickly about what I meant by each of them, but basically a diagnostic criterion was one that was more helpful to diagnose the problems at hand. And so in the context of scientific theories, you think a decent theory, a good theory, is one that helps you diagnose the problems in the previous apparatus and in the previous scientific theories, that is able to give you a better explanation of the grounds and of the scope of a particular problem. And of course, in the case of the political realm, the problem was political conflict. And so it's the conflicts that are related to the kinds of dynamics that we live through. And in the case of the particular global justice debate that I was interested in, it was the conflicts of globalization. So both of these theories, the statists on the one hand and the cosmopolitans on the other, were just looking at the world around them and saying, we understand the conflict to be driven by this, and the other group had another account. So the second criterion was one that I called the innovating criteria, because it argued that a theory or a set of theories is more able than its rivals to reflect on the problems, but also to offer a solution to the problems that it's reflecting on when it innovates over an existing body of thought in a way that preserves the normative benefits of its predecessors, but remedies their failures. And again, I think if you think about justice and you think about development in the norms of justice, what you want to do is you want to preserve the ability of these norms of justice to redress, to give people whatever they had before, but also try and create infrastructures of application of political norms that expand whatever you could do in the past, and that enables you to innovate, as I say, over whatever other bodies of theories were able to do in the past. And the third one is that a family, I thought that it was a heuristic criterion, because again it came from philosophy of science, and the argument was that a theory or a family of theories is better able to capture, to resolve a problem than its rivals when it not only diagnoses better what is the source of the problem, not only it innovates in terms of offering solutions to the problem, but has also some insight into what could be future difficulties that arise from the application of this theory. So detects new problem areas and is able to offer you some anticipation of what these new problem areas might be. So I think if we follow this kind of general account in any particular context of the justification of political norms, we can identify the principles that enable these basic functions of justice to be discharged, and we can compare different theories of justice by thinking about how they discharge these different principles. And we can do that by observing instances of challenge to these systems of justice with a view to scrutinizing whether we should uphold the interpretations that we have in the legal systems, in the constitutions, in the bodies of norms that we have, or whether we can look elsewhere and we can try to innovate and to reject and refine or replace them with more adequate ones. And so the claim is that a theory or a family of theories is one that is more progressive if it contributes to revising and modifying principles of justice so that the function of moral and political norms is discharged by institutions in a way that preserves all the normative benefits of the rivals but avoids the pitfalls. And a normative theory is regressive if it doesn't do that. Okay, so now I think I'm going to skip this part and maybe move to some of the objections that I think there are to this way of thinking about to think about justice and to think about functional refinements. And I want to sort of just look at some of the criticisms that I have come through as I was trying to articulate this account, and start by saying that, okay, I've argued that the interpretation of the function and the purpose of political institutions should be sensitive to the historical process of functional refinement of particular norms. And so the more these norms are intersubjectively endorsed by agents and reflected in the social and political institutions that they collectively construct, the more they are justified. The more they are justified, the greater their contribution to moral and political progress is. And the more progress we make, the closer we are to a sense of reaching, coming to the appropriate response to justice as a result of this process of trial and failure and success. So all of this raises the following question. We don't know if a particular practice is progressive unless we know the direction of the movement, and we can only know if a direction is right or wrong if we have access to an independent standard that tells us where to go. So if we want to maintain that political progress is made by correcting the mistakes of the past rather than being able to foresee the future, we have to be able to rely on actual historical practices as making a normative contribution to the refinement of these norms of justice. Now, it looks like if we proceed in this kind of fallibilistic way, which takes seriously the fact that we're learning from history, in some ways we become hostage to history. And so it raises the difficulty, which is that the historical survival of particular moral and political norms may not be sufficient evidence of the fact that they are normatively defensible. So the fact that a view survives could be for any reason, says the objection, says the criticism. So the fact, just the mere survival of a body of norms doesn't mean that it's the right body of norms, because it could have survived just because of sheer violence or manipulation or transformation of preferences and so on. So could a particular set of norms, again the critic says, have prevailed just because someone was really good at coercing and exploiting and manipulating the preferences and desires of others, or just because they were so good at eliminating all the alternatives? And that's where the question of accessing an independent standard is important, because if you had this independent standard, then you wouldn't be just depending on the dynamics of history in a way. And so couldn't our beliefs, and this is the big question, that, as you know, at the beginnings of the Republic, Socrates is fighting Thrasymachus about what is justice. And so Thrasymachus basically objects, well, couldn't justice just be the rule of the stronger? And so just the result of ideological manipulation and power struggle. And so is there really anything more dignified than that to respond from a normative perspective? And other than the fact that just because we are in this vantage point of the present, we look at the past and we say, well, we have clearly made progress in this, but I've called this objection the arrogance of the presence objection. That is to say, it's the present point of view that tells us with this kind of arrogance that everything that came before us was implausible and so on. So I think the arrogance of the present objection would have force if we were willing to recognize as valid any sort of criteria on the circumstances under which agents make choices and make decisions, and make moral decisions, and under which they interpret the function of particular political institutions. But I don't think we need to be that charitable to history in a way, because remember, we're not talking just about history, we're talking about philosophical history. So the philosophical perspective matters in our assessment of viewpoints and conflicts and interpretations of different principles in history. So we could say that the function of justice is refined only if successive generations are willing to endorse the principles invoked, even in circumstances where that initial duress is no longer there. So you have run a kind of counterfactual thought experiment where you say, if I were to remove the coercion and the exploitation and the manipulation, would that body of views still survive, or can one see or envisage something slightly different? So, and to explain this point, I'll give an example that returns to the idea of progress as a process of functional refinement. Remember, we said that one of the fundamental roles of justice is to justify the coercive use of power by regulating access to the benefits and burdens of social cooperation. And the function of justice is served through different political and social arrangements at different points in time. Now, suppose at some point, I mean, it's a thought experiment, but it's not that much of a thought experiment because it actually happened in the past. Suppose at some point that you justify the application of norms of justice with reference to birth rank. And so you say the people who are born in a particular rank of a particular status have no right. The people who are born in this other status are the only ones that have right, and so on. And suppose that this is the only norm that people can conceive of at the time. And again, this is very abstract and speculative because in practice, in history, people always come up also with a counterfactual interpretation. So, but imagine you have a society that is completely dominated by this, let's call it slaveholder mentality, where all the slaves are convinced that they deserve slaveholding rules or that there is nothing else that one can see in the future, and where everyone who belongs to the lower rank endorses and accepts these norms. So serfs are dissatisfied, but they may not have, imagine, another alternative way of thinking about how to run their society, how to regulate the use of power, and they don't have the means to experiment with subverting the norms because they're too weak. So imagine now that for whatever reason, a war, a catastrophe, a financial, yes, also, but an environmental disaster, at some point this balance of the political community gets broken. There is a conflict out there, and people start questioning the way that they have up to that point organized their society and try to think about alternative models. So given, and this is just to explain what I meant by thinking that a body of norms needs to be robust across counterfactuals, would the successive generation go back to the same rules if the constraints that they initially had to, that forced them to respect and to comply with authority in that way were removed, and if the manipulation or the ideological constraints or the epistemic ignorance about alternative viewpoints were removed? And so if the answer is no, it means that a body of norms that was at one point contributing to the functional refinement of this ethical code no longer serves its historical role. And this test, I think, places constraints on the kinds of views that we have available in the present when we're thinking about their history and whether to go back and revisit a particular body of norms or whether to innovate over that body of norms. So this gives us, this gives a second objection, which is the one that I'm also going to say something briefly about, which is that it seems to give us only a kind of post-factum reconstruction of learning processes that we seem to have now internalized, but seems to be unable to generate critical insights about the future, because the view is only thinking about, okay, what did history, how can we look at history, and it's based on a kind of philosophical interpretation of history. Now, can that philosophical interpretation of history be enough to think about the future? Does it give us any prescriptions about the future, or does it only enable us to say what went wrong in the past, in a way? So how can we generate prescriptions? By simply telling the history of political progress in the past. So I'm going to just answer this objection by going back to this global justice debate that I was referring to, and to the problem of global justice and the role of what I mentioned in my book as the role of activist political agents in the defense of a particular account of the function and purpose on global institutions. I said that in my book, I talked about the importance of activist agents on the ground who are both able to interpret the diagnosed conflicts of the present, conflicts around globalization, with an eye to both understanding the causes of those conflicts, but also giving prescriptive principles that are able to go beyond what their rivals are able to offer in terms of innovating over the existing body of norms that we have. The example was, in the case of my book, was that of the state, where I said that the state is exactly the kind of institutions that these global activist agents need to challenge, even though the state is important for them from a pragmatic instrumental perspective. From a normative perspective, it can no longer be defended because it doesn't innovate over the kinds of institutional solutions that they had found up to that point. And I talked about the importance of these avant-garde agents because they were important to signal to us in society where the sites of conflict are, and to engage with these sites of conflict in a way that enables us to reflect on the future in terms of trying to distinguish between progressive and regressive political agents engaged in these conflicts. And again, the example there might be, you can think of conflicts around globalization now, or conflicts around migration. There's a number of social movements operating in society, and a number of them making claims of injustice or exploitation, or talking about different groups who are fighting each other and so on. Now, we can't, of course we have to be interested in what social movements do and how they contribute to remedying this conflict. But we can't approach these social movements in a purely empirical way that just says, well, any movement out there that contests the status quo is in some ways helpful to articulate theory. So what you need is a kind of dialectical relationship between theory and practice, whereby the agent tells you what's wrong in society, so gives you a sense that there's this conflict, and gives you a sense of what's, there's contestation around the state, or boundaries, or migration, and so on. The theory asks itself, what is this movement contributing to rethinking the foundation of the institutions under which we live, and to rethinking justice, and to rethinking the functional refinement of the way in which we address questions of power. And then, with the help of theory, you kind of go back to the practice and ask yourselves questions that force you to distinguish between progressive and regressive political movements. And that's why this discourse around progress is really important, because you need to be able to articulate in the political world distinctions between different social groups engaged in these conflicts that are themselves the result of philosophical and theoretical reflection. So you can't leave it completely to the practice, because you need a kind of theoretical and philosophical standpoint, but you can't leave it completely to the theory, because the theory needs to understand what kind of conflicts there are in society to know when it's productive and why it needs to reflect on institutions in this way. So instances of political practice basically direct our attention to the kinds of problems that need to be solved, and so to the kinds of problems that ask for a diagnosis in some ways. And theorists then develop principles that contribute to the functional refinement of these norms that underpin these practices, and then agency and principles combine together in a way that helps us approach the question of history from this philosophical perspective, which I think is very much out of fashion right now, because if you talk about philosophy of history, it looks like you're kind of coming up with this, people see Hegelian images of like history marching forward and making claims on behalf of a particular part of the world against other parts of the world, and so on. So this doesn't imply, this particular way in which I'm trying to account for the relationship between principles and agency doesn't imply that there is a hierarchical division of labor whereby the activist is just a kind of foot soldier of the theory. Because the activist has a really important role to play in directing theory, in orienting theory to go in a particular dimension. And the project is itself developed in dialogue with social movements and with conversations around justice and with contestations around of power. But, and of course, one can argue that we can avoid some of these problems by aiming at constructing an account of progress which is redescriptive rather than action guiding, and where you don't just kind of renounce normative prescriptions and focus on educating agents for the purpose of just successfully kind of training them for the future, but you also need to endorse certain principles in order to be able to engage with these agents in the right way. Okay, so really last few words. One might argue, and this is really my kind of third possible critique, that by taking the history of political progress to help us make normative prescriptions about the future and rethink how we need to regulate the use of power for the future, we kind of commit, some people say, at least in Anglo-Saxon American, that this is a kind of naturalistic fallacy that derives an ought from an is, and they say this is a problem. And I think what is important to clarify here is that this is not really deriving an ought from an is. It's deriving an ought from another kind of ought, because all of these dynamics are dynamics that have to do with just justification of power. Whenever there is the law, whenever there are institutions, whenever there is politics in practice, a claim is already being made on subjects that is a normative claim. The question is, what is the purchase of that normative claim in rethinking the use of power in the present compared to how it might have discharged that function of justice in the past? So the question isn't really that we're looking at the practice and we're just telling the practice to orient all our thinking. We're looking at the practice as already a kind of meaningful whole that has already a normative function, and we're trying to rethink that normative function. So I think, and so we can be kind of neutral on where then the question, where does the first normative ought come from, which is what seems to bother a lot of Anglo-American political philosophers, which is, where does this first ought come from? I think we can, from the point of view of politics and from the point of view of political philosophy, it doesn't really matter in a way where the ought comes from, because the claims are always being made and they're always there, and so we don't kind of wake up in the morning and say, well, where does history come from? It's just there. But what we can do, as I say, is to develop a way of thinking about history that recovers a philosophical method of reflection on historical events that can help us then reintegrate history into our thinking for the politics of the present, but also with that of the future. So I think what I try to do in this paper is to really just give you a sense of why political progress is a distinctive type of question, raises a distinctive type of question on progress compared to moral progress, to try and suggest, although, as I say, it's very tentative still, a potential connection between political progress on the one hand and the concept of justice in its relationship to power and authority on the other. And finally, to also think about how justifications of the coercive use of power that give rise to justice-based norms are subject to functional refinement in history, and how we can then reflect around that functional refinement and make that the core of a theory of progress, which I hope is a theory of progress that doesn't rest on the kinds of prejudices that we started with that leads to these problematic instances of colonialism and paternalism and so on, but that gives us a critical theory of progress that is itself able to incorporate those very discussions of progress in how it thinks of itself in the future. So, thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Lea, for your presentation. I would invite Professor Guaraldo here with us. Cosa facciamo? Scorriamo? O... Ci passo. Ok. Grazie. And pass the microphone so that she can address some of the issues.
Thank you.
That just touched upon.
Thank you very much, Lea. Can I say Lea? Thank you very much for this talk, this very inspiring talk, and very ambitious, I would say, in the way it tackles a lot of issues that are for us political philosophers big issues. I would like to just start in a very colloquial way, if you allow me, because I must say that I don't belong to the normative type of political philosophy. I'm an Arendtian scholar. I've studied Hannah Arendt for all my life, and so I have a different sort of language dealing with political philosophy, but still I understand the importance of the issues that you tackle. Let me just start from the very end, where you put this possible objection of deriving an ought from an is, okay? So my question would, to some extent, also involve your work on avant-garde, and I have another question on that later, and on the way that you deal with the issue of power. So let's see if I can put it in an understandable way. When you claim at the beginning of your paper and also in other works that power is needed to remedy the failures of altruism, okay? And I think it's a very effective way of putting that immediately one understands that power is necessary because human beings are not naturally good. And of course, because you're a Kantian, and I read your things, very, very good things on Kant, they're not naturally good, but they're neither naturally bad. So my question would be exactly in the terms of the issue of what is and what ought to be. So how do we define what is? So my claim would come from the what we call the realismo politico, okay? So realismo politico would say, you know, we don't ask ourselves what ought or what could be, but we just deal with what is. So one of the problems that I always find with this approach in my study of political philosophy is that it always makes a statement, makes a claim on reality as that which is conflictual, violent, aggressive is necessarily more real than being good, cooperative, altruistic, and this and that. So this is my problem with the political realism. So, and usually political realism refers to history as a, you know, as a base, evidence base for their argument. I think, well, but this is just a conversation. I would like to know what you think about it. But I think that, so in order to understand what is, and then possibly shape what ought to be, I think that we need to take into account not only that altruism needs remedies, you know what I mean? That maybe altruism has been framed in ways, from the realist perspective, has been framed in ways that make altruism always defeated to some extent, always the weak position. So everything, realist position tells us that we have to look at the real stuff, and the real stuff is war, conflict. I would say that in order to understand what is, the realist position should take into account a larger portion of what can be considered real, you know, in terms of altruism, in terms of cooperation, in terms also of power understood not only as domination in the Arendtian sense, but power as doing things together, as the surging energy that human beings have, and to look at politics also in that way, not just in the frame according to which power is a dimension of coercion or of norms that. So this would be my comment, and to some extent I would like to link this comment to your notion of avant-garde and also on your notion of activist political theory, which I find very interesting. At the beginning of your book on avant-garde, you say that avant-garde agents have three features. They are those political agents that represent an avant-garde are those who are vulnerable to effects of political institutions, are then informants of the theorist, and they can also render normative views politically effective. What interests me is really this idea. I think it's a very, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's a very original way to put it, that avant-garde actors are the most vulnerable. It's a non-Leninist way of looking at avant-garde. So I would like to know more on that. But connected to this, to the relationship that you establish between the avant-garde actors, you also spoke briefly about it here, the relationship between avant-garde actors and the theorist, okay? So let's say the relationship between social movements and theory. And you mentioned that there is no hierarchical division of labor, but I think this would be my critique. I think you're rather optimistic on the role of theory, on the humbleness of theory. I think you presuppose too much of a humbleness of theory and theoreticians or philosophers, because I have this thing in mind, and this thing in mind comes back to me because I really observe political reality quite a lot. And as a matter of fact, your book on your life, I had to mention this, your book on your life offers very extremely important insights for political philosopher. So I observe political movements, political phenomena, but what I see since the so-called Arab Spring, what I see is how can I put it? A sort of suffocating effect of theory towards the movements, or as if the theory has become the new catechon. So they want to keep, just stop, to avoid things to happen, things to evolve. So that would be sort of my, critique or interlocution with you. Thank you.
Okay, it seems there's a lot on your plate, Lea, and there are very rich stimuli. So I would say, if you agree, that you can answer those, and then we ask our public here what they think, and I might have some comments, but I can share them later. Thank you.
So first, I'll say something about the fact that I completely agree, actually, with your assessment of political realism, and I think we're exactly on the same page on that one, and also on the one-sided use of history, and the fact that exactly as you describe, it's only seen from a particular perspective. And maybe you might be right that in some ways the kind of remedying altruism narrative, which is something that I borrowed from Philip Kitcher and the more pragmatic sort of Anglo-Saxon philosophers, I think maybe that narrative reinforces the point that they are making by buying into the fact that there is this altruism failure. And so I think you're right. I take the point that maybe that there's a better way of phrasing it, which doesn't completely concede to this political realist narrative on power, and that sees power from a different perspective, which is partly where I'm also trying to go in terms of saying, look, yes, there is power, but there are also reasons with which power is being exercised, and we need to look into the reasons. And the discussion that I was trying to open on the relationship between justice and power was exactly going in that direction. So I'm completely on board with that entire way of actually thinking about political realism, with the way in which they interpret history and so on, often with this very, I think, really bad Machiavellianism, because when one looks at real Machiavelli, you really don't have this, this sense that, in history there is reason for Machiavelli, and it's not just this kind of brutal force coercion, the way in which political realists describe it. So I think it's really kind of Machiavelli, a kind of bad version of it, and not very sophisticated, not very nuanced. So you are, as you say in Italian, sfondare una porta aperta on the political realism thing. I think on the avant-garde agent, when I wrote the book, I was thinking about it especially from a position of actually awareness of the limits of this other way of thinking about the vanguard kind of movements and the vanguard parties and so on, which was always positive, and which left to some extent the reasons for why there is a need for political intervention in one domain or in one conflict, they seem to be not accounted for, because it's as though they start with a conflict, but it's not clear, why this conflict rather than this other conflict. So just to give a kind of crude example, why, if you think about the French Revolution, in the French Revolution you have groups that are made worse off, and groups that are, a lot of different groups are made worse off. So the question is, where does one, worse off? so suffer from injustice, or let's say I'm part of the clergy, so the clergy also suffers from the from the French Revolution one way or another. Why does theory think that it's philosophically and politically relevant to theorize about this particular group rather than this other particular group? Because every conflict in society can be articulated in one way or another. So we can kind of draw general features, and I can be, I don't know, a no-vaxxer, or I can be an anti-masker, and I can create a social group out of there. So why do I think that this particular social group deserves of philosophical inquiry rather than this other group? And I felt that in some ways all of these groups have a vulnerability, but the questions, the reasons that make them vulnerable are not equal for all of them. And by not thinking about the reasons, we're not able to distinguish between these different groups. And so then all social movements become the same, and every instance of contestation of power becomes the same. And so there is a need for... So for me, vulnerability is the starting point, and it's important, I think, especially if one is trying to learn and to think about history in this more critical way, in particular with regard to post-colonial struggles, or black activist struggles, or you mentioned my book, coming from Eastern Europe, thinking about a particular relationship to Western European powers and the effect, even epistemically, of that whole history on certain countries. It's really important to start with the vulnerability, because that signals that there is a problem that needs to be resolved, and one doesn't even look at the problem if one doesn't start with the vulnerability. But that's not enough. Then I think one really needs to reflect philosophically on the vulnerability and on the conflicts and on the social movements, and that's where we get to your other question, which is to do with the limitations of theory in a way. And again, I think I take the point that theory doesn't. Even if it does resolve the problem in theory, just because it detects a problem, or just because it even is able to anticipate a solution, that is not, it's neither here nor there politically. And in fact, and I'm now thinking, Anglo-American political philosophy has spent now 30, 40 years talking about the theory of justice and distinguishing between, 15 different versions of egalitarianism, and the metric of egalitarianism is its resources, its opportunities, and so on. When you live in a world where I think, just take any of them will be fine, will be such a departure from the status quo and from the world in which we live. So I think, but on the other hand, the problem with that response has led to this complete division of labor between the theorists on the one hand and politics on the other, and where I think political theories, maybe that's not the case in continental Europe, or at least in the parts of academia where I am active, political theories are completely disinterested in the world, actually. They just go on their own, they have their own language, they have their own discussions, they have their own parables, but they're just really not engaged at all with the conflicts of the world. And so I felt that, and in fact they have theorized this in this distinction between ideal and non-ideal theory, which is basically a collapse of theory, of kind of surrendering to the effort to mediate between them, which is what theory has always done, I think. So I think, I take the point that there is a kind of arrogance on the one hand of political theory when it engages with social movements, but the way I see the state of political theory right now is actually the problem is not really arrogance, it's arrogance only because of entrenchment and isolation from the outside world. And I would accept a little bit of, pushing the philosophers out there for the sake of just recovering the role of philosophers as still active in public life and still trying to contribute and make sense of the societies in which they live.
As a matter of, I think we are talking about, sorry, I just wanted briefly, I think we really talk from different perspectives, because I understand what you say, whereas my perception in continental Europe is that sometimes political philosophers want the social movement they want. If there's not the social movement is like they say, then it's not good enough. So this was the issue. But I like that you end, the last chapter of your book is philosophers have interpreted the world and now they have to change it. So it's a Marx quotation. Thank you.
But if you want to know more about that, you have to read the book, of course. Sorry. So any questions, comments, curiosities? Alternative answers to the question, what is political progress? Professor Lorenzini, Professor Nicoletti. Io vedevo lì.
So I'm a historian, so I kind of feel like I have to kind of jump in the challenge somehow, well, the point that I was even commenting here with my neighbor Professor Fracasso, that as when I'm a historian of development, so a lot of ideas of progress and colonial arrogance involved in it, in the things I work on, the social and economic weight of facts and ideas is much more there than in your picture, and I kind of felt like the concept of justice and the articulations of that and the prospects and the evolutionary pattern that you describe, I felt like it's hasn't got enough elements of the economic and social impact of this story. So could you add something to that? So kind of made your philosophical, political philosophy more historic. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think, when we defend the importance of a philosophical perspective on history, I think it's important to insist that it's a perspective. And so it's really about a way to look at history, which often is not, and in fact is there because history is not compatible with that perspective. So the perspective has a critical function that enables people to kind of engage with history, enables publics, but not just publics, also vulnerable subjects in history, and as I was saying earlier, to situate themselves into this history of oppressions and colonialism and injustice and so on, and to look at moments in history where this pattern gets contested. And from that contestation, draw a kind of horizon or an orientation that enables them to reflect. But it's not empirical history, and I think it's actually compatible, and this is maybe one of the biggest things that has been lost from the Enlightenment, is that when people criticize the Enlightenment and Enlightenment ideas of history, they criticize them as though the Enlightenment was making empirical claims about the societies of the Enlightenment. In fact, it was actually called, in the first versions of philosophy of history, it was called conjectural history. Why? Because it was a conjecture. It was a thought experiment that is based on how you look at the world if the world were organized compatibly with these philosophical ideals. And that's where also, the big utopias came about and why they play this kind of critical function, why sometimes societies outside Europe were idealized and thought of as, presenting models that were very different from European societies. So I think philosophically it had the opposite function of the one that it has actually had politically. And I think this is maybe one of the kind of greatest tragedies of the Enlightenment, is that it was appropriated by political elites and put in the service of what I think was an economic political project, which was the expansion of capitalism to the outside world, and completely forgot about this other legacy which the Enlightenment also had, which was to empower people who are actually at the margins at the periphery through these narratives that were created and constructed exactly to kind of bring a philosophical orientation. So I think, I completely take the point. I think often these ways of looking at history, the philosophical history, is there and is important because the real history is not going in the way in which the philosophical history says that it should be going. So it's almost to kind of give you another world from which you can look at the realities of your time. But it's history. And this is, again, why it's important that it's history in the history of political thought rather than the way in which political theorists now do it, which is by thought experiments and by imagining realities and kind of coming up with counterfactuals and so on. Because the point of it was to show those inhabitants of these societies, look, it's really happened. It's possible. People can be motivated. It's the French Revolution or it's some event or other. They are not just kind of constructions in the philosopher's mind. Whereas where we are at now, and again, maybe this may be just me kind of coming from this very particular literature, but where you're at now is that you kind of constantly create counterfactual situations, thought experiments, so that you can kind of refine the principles and so on, without any connection to the world. And then, in the end, you've disabled the theory from making any contribution.
Professor Nicoletti.
So, thank you very much for this wonderful speech. Two questions. The first one is related to your interpretation of the relationship between morality and politics. I don't know if I correctly got your point, but I understand that you see politics as a kind of support for morality in terms of give coordination and continuity to some moral principles that the human beings already have. So an instrumental vision of the political. My question could be Machiavelli or Hegel. Is this not a too weak interpretation of the political? I mean, the political per se does not represent a progress. The constitution of the political, the creation of a political body is not per se a progress. This is my first question. And the second one is related to the idea of progress that you have. How can your interpretation of progress be applied to a dialectical vision of progress? Because you speak a lot in terms of progress, of refinement. Also your concept of innovation is attentive to maintaining what people have already gained. But progress means also negation, revolution, destruction, and so on. So how can you interpret this dialectic dimension of progress?
Yeah, great. Thank you. These are really great questions. I think the second, maybe I'll start with the second one because it may be a little bit, maybe a little bit easier for me, in the sense that I agree that there is a kind of role that revolutions and ruptures play and so on. But the point is that when we look at the function of revolutions also historically, I think we need to be able to reconstruct from a philosophical perspective which of these ruptures contributes in some ways to progress and which one doesn't. So the difference between a revolution and reaction, for example, restoration. I think there are criteria there are philosophical criteria that we put in place when we think about when there is this rupture, what does the rupture, how does it reflect on justice, on norms of justice, on norms of recognition, or however we want to put them, depending on the kind of philosophical framework that we have in place. So I don't think I want to deny, when I say it's a process of functional refinement of norms, refinement, and I said this at the beginning, can come in many ways. It can come because of natural disaster, it can come because there's a revolution, it can come in unexpected ways that we can't control. But the point is that whenever there is a rupture of that kind, and whenever there is a crisis of that kind, we have to be able to link that rupture to the previous one, or to put that into a kind of continuum. And I think maybe that's where I would go in a slightly different direction from people who say, when there's a rupture, the whole thing changes. There's absolutely no way there's no continuity in human history. And, everything changes, it's a completely new epistemic paradigm and so on. I think that's where I would probably be cautious about going, because I think there is something to the human condition and to the human being that in some ways is preserved across time. And that maybe that takes me to the first question, which is about the relationship between morality and politics. I think there is a kind of autonomy of the political if we look at it historically. So we don't know, and it may come about for mysterious reasons, may come about for non-moral reasons and so on. But I think we are at a point in our accounting of politics where we don't just assess the political by its own criteria, but we also deploy moral criteria. And what I was trying to say was that, again, there must be a way of linking morality and politics. And I mean, I'm a Hegelian of sorts, but I think what links it in Hegel is freedom, and that is universal. And so, again, maybe remedying altruism failures is a particularly kind of Anglo-Saxon way of putting it, and there may be a different alternative tradition by which one would frame it slightly differently. But for me, the point is that the relationship between these two realms can't be one of complete separation, as in the political realist literature, for example. So.
Any other question? Yes. Professor Carta. Giusto? Costa. Professor Costa. I'm apologize.
Well, you must be aware that it wasn't easy to follow the details of your argument. So if I'm allowed to go to the basics, well, I'll ask you a very straightforward question. You speak a lot about political progress, but your view allows you to, for example, to distinguish between two different forms of government, a Republican government and a benevolent, technological government, and say one is clearly political progress, the other not. Is your view able to give us that? Easily, when you don't understand, you want examples of that is my question.
I mean, I think it does, and I think it leads, if you kind of develop the view in a way in which I haven't developed it here because I didn't have time, and also because it's not that developed in my head, but what I would like to do, if I were to develop it, I would actually come with a defense of radical democracy as the way through which you can instantiate this view. And I would say that then a radical global democracy is a more appropriate refinement of the function of justice than a republican government or a kind of technocratic government that is technologically refined and so on. So I think the view, when you kind of think about because it would go back to the part of the paper where I was talking about functional refinement in solving political problems. And the question is, how do we know when there is a political problem? And one of the answers is that we only know if we have a frame of framing the problem as a problem. And therefore, when we have the right political mechanisms and the right political institutions that enable us to actually know that there is a problem. And in the world in which we are now, often we have, again, the views of elites and we have views of particular governments or particular states and so on, but it's not clear that the views that we get are the views that we would get if there was a more democratic way of reflecting on the conditions under which people live. So I think you can take the view to a point where it becomes where it gives you an account of a set of political institutions that enable you to relate to justice in a certain way, but I haven't done it yet. I mean, I haven't done it here, so I think you're right. Your question is fair. It's just that.
But you don't see the function talk is what worries me most. The idea of the functional refinement. If you use function, I don't see how you can distinguish between self-rule and a very mild, benevolent kind of technocracy. Well, just give me an example of political progress that can enable you to distinguish between two different ways of life. It's so, in terms of functional requirements,
So let me try it a different way. If we say that the way in which we talk about functional refinement of justice is by thinking about reasons that justify power. And this is where I was trying to go by saying, look, there's authority, and authorities exercise power on people, and they exercise power with reasons. Now, some of these reasons are reasons that have to do just with ideological manipulation, elite oppression, what have you. So the kinds of reasons that most of the time historically have prevailed. Sometimes the reasons are to do with discourses. And both of these things are there and have been present historically. And I think we can make a judgment in terms of which regime types are the ones that are more compatible with giving reasons rather than manipulating ideologically coercion and so on, and which ones aren't. And I think that brings us into then the next kind of the intermediate level, which is again the one that I haven't developed, which is the one about regime types, which is kind of what the Greeks were all arguing about and wondering about. And I think with that, you can think about the function of justice in terms of articulating reasons through which power is justified. That's just what I meant. I mean, there may be a more, more kind of straightforward way of putting the argument, but basically that's what I'm interested in.
Thank you.
Yes, there's a question of... no? Okay. Sorry. I'm keeping track.
Yeah, you speak about reasons for justifying power, but I mean, my question is, how do you define those reasons in a more absolute sense? Because I mean, I'm sure that when you talk about elite suppression, I mean, those elites, even right now, they have reasons, but they are their reasons. I mean, when you talk about reasons, there's always, when you get to the point of the question, there is like, I mean, I believe a political question that you have to ask yourself, and everybody has to ask themselves. And there's no room for reason on an absolute sense, because everybody has reasons, but the point is that you have to make a political choice, which is not really based on an absolute sense of rationality that you cannot that can be defensible. It's an absolute sense. It's just a political choice. So how do you fit this kind of thing into your theory?
Yeah. Well, so I'm a Kantian. And so for a Kantian, there's always a distinction between reason and so between moral reason and instrumental, pragmatic, ideological reasons and so on. And that distinction is actually fundamental because it enables you to say, yes, there is always in the historical world reason of the kind that you've just mentioned. So the elites have their own reasons that are shaped by their interests and so on. But what does it, when you're trying to assess about those reasons and to say, are they compatible with moral reasons or not, you ask yourself, do these reasons function in a counterfactual way or in a counterfactual world when these elites don't have the same interests that motivate them to act in a certain way? So let's say I don't know, Elon Musk, who is ruining Twitter, ruining the public sphere for his own, because he wants to make money and so on and so on. If I remove these kinds of ideological or material interest constraint and so on, I think even Elon Musk has reason of the kind of moral kind. Now, that may not be as strong, and that's where we get to the question of history and politics and so on. It may not be enough to kind of motivate him to act in the moral way, but I think for the Kantian, that's neither here nor there. In a way, the reason is always there. So what people would need to convince me of is that we don't even have this basic capacity in a way in which, Kant says even the worst criminal, when he commits a wrongful act, he knows that it's wrong, or she. Or it, but and that may not be enough to stop him, which is where we go back to this question of radical evil and motives and history and so on. But that's for the point of view of orientation, and that doesn't collapse the distinction. It just tells us that the distinction sometimes in the empirical world is very, very hard to maintain for all kinds of historical contingencies. Yeah.
So there was a question there. And yes, thank you very much.
Io posso parlare in italiano perché l'inglese la conosco solo passivamente. Io ho letto gli ultimi 2 giorni Libera, Diventare, grandi alla fine della storia. E alla fine del libro, finora i filosofi hanno solo interpretato il mondo, adesso si tratta di cambiarlo. Io vorrei capire cosa possono fare i filosofi, che ruolo devono svolgere? Devono sostituire i preti, i imam o i politici? Partendo da una storia comune del socialismo reale, che sono nata e cresciuta in quel sistema, magari ho una decina di anni più di te e ho conosciuto un pochino di più, mi viene da dire questa teoria, questa sensazione, questa dell'avanguardia prende la radice da quelle parti per poter svilupparsi, per cambiare il mondo solo con le normative, perché io capisco dal 91 fino al 2000 è stato questo periodo di transizione caotica e partono da questa riflessione, questa teoria riguardo al politico, all'agire politico, morale.
Non ho capito bene l'ultima parte della domanda, ho capito la prima parte
La
della
prima,
domanda.
va bene, e questa è una seconda domanda allora, cioè la normativa, quanto è valida e quanto è flessibile e quanto impedisce.
Mm-hmm.
Grazie.
Sì, ok. rispondo in inglese o italiano? Continuo in inglese.
Anche in inglese, va bene, capisco.
Se no, vabbè, ci provo anche in italiano, solo che ogni tanto ho difficoltà a fare la transizione dall'una all'altra. Allora, cosa possono fare i filosofi? Io penso che il discorso è uno di divisione del lavoro nella società, no? Ognuno ha, un medico ha la funzione di curare il corpo, un filosofo ha la funzione di stimolare la mente con pensieri critici, eccetera. E io credo nel fatto che in un mondo complesso come il nostro non è che c'è il filosofo qua, il prete che sostituisce il prete, nel senso che ha tutta la conoscenza necessaria del mondo, del senso della vita, eccetera, eccetera, e deve impartirlo in una dottrina. Penso però che è importante che ci siano anche persone che fanno questo. E una delle difficoltà, secondo me, visto che hai parlato un po' della transizione, della difficoltà dei paesi post-comunisti, eccetera, una delle difficoltà, secondo me, della transizione in questi paesi è che è morta la filosofia, cioè è morta proprio il desiderio di pensare, perché c'è stata questa difficoltà con la storia, questa colpevolizzazione nel bene o nel male della filosofia, delle elite politiche, che ha avuto anche a che fare con il modo in cui le elite si sono appropriati della filosofia per semplicemente realizzare i loro scopi banali, interessi materiali di elite, eccetera, che con la filosofia non avevano molto a che fare. Però il problema è che in un mondo così complesso, infatti un po' questa è la questione che sollevo anche nel libro autobiografico, in un mondo così lacerato, in cui diviso, no, tra i buoni e i cattivi, quelli che hanno sfruttato, quelli che sono stati sfruttati, di grande complessità storica, di grande ingiustizia anche, il problema è che per uscire da questo conflitto si è deciso di colpevolizzare semplicemente le idee. Infatti nessuno crede più alla filosofia. Io penso di essere un animale abbastanza raro in Albania che è uscito dall'Albania, ha fatto filosofia, eccetera, perché il risultato di quel percorso, ma non soltanto del percorso dei 50 anni, ma anche delle modalità di distruzione di quel sistema, è stato quello che io descrivo nel libro. Dico, siccome le persone non sapevano come rendere i conti l'uno all'altro, hanno deciso di uccidere i concetti. E quindi a me questa cosa, quindi non si tratta di innalzare il filosofo al ruolo del prete, si tratta di salvare quel poco che si può salvare in un pensiero che riesce a riflettere criticamente sulla società in cui ci troviamo. E quindi anche lì, anche il ruolo dell'avanguardia, non è che l'avanguardia è avanguardia perché guida tutti gli altri, è avanguardia nel senso di appunto cercare di recuperare, di salvare qualcosa di questo sforzo di riflessione critica sul mondo in cui ci troviamo. Quindi non è un mondo in cui vincono i filosofi, è un mondo in cui bisogna salvare quello che si può della filosofia.
Posso dire una cosa rispetto a questo? Scusate, non resisto perché bisognava alla fine arrivare a parlare di questo libro, ma io non voglio entrare nel dettaglio del libro, ma voglio solo dire questo, che esattamente per quello che tu hai appena detto, per tutta la complessità della fine di quel mondo che io adesso sto leggendo anche per quanto riguarda la fine dell'Unione Sovietica nei libri di Svetlana Alexievich, e vedo dagli occhi di occidentale come io, che avevo 19 anni nell'89, che ero così comunista che non mi interessava il crollo del muro di Berlino, giusto per spiegarci, cioè era il mio primo anno di università a Bologna. Però appunto eravamo tutti così di sinistra che non abbiamo prestato alcuna attenzione alla fine di quel mondo, non ce ne sia, almeno insomma nel milieu delle persone, dei miei coetanei. Ci siamo molto interessati alla guerra nel Golfo, perché naturalmente dove c'è l'America è sempre una grande calamita, no? L'America, per essere contrastata. Però io quello che volevo dire è che la complessità, le sfumature, le nuance di quello che è successo, che tu racconti nel libro a partire dalla tua esperienza, ma insomma fai davvero un affresco di un mondo, non poteva che dirlo la letteratura. La filosofia non avrebbe mai saputo dirlo, secondo me.
Sì, sì, penso, non lo so, sì, sicuramente non la, cioè se avessi scritto un articolo da mandare in una rivista peer reviewed,
no, beh, quello sicuro. Però il paradosso è che per salvare, cioè tu racconti bene la necessità di salvare i concetti attraverso però le storie.
Sì, ma sì, un po' perché secondo me il problema della fine del comunismo è veramente un po' come il problema del rapporto tra le crociate e la religione e la fede, no? Cioè io penso che la fede sia fondamentale, poi uno porta la fede in una direzione, uno porta la fede in un'altra direzione, però io penso che l'elemento della fede e il suo rapporto col sapere sia fondamentale a una vita sensata, perché se non c'è la fede uno va e si spana. E penso che il problema, io, per come lo vedo io, lo sviluppo del comunismo era veramente un movimento animato dalla fede dell'umanità che si ritrova a un certo punto con veramente la realtà delle crociate, cioè il sangue, l'orrore, l'oppressione. Sì. E la cosa che ha fatto partire la mia riflessione nel libro era appunto il fatto che ad ovest dell'Albania, dei paesi sovietici, non c'era per niente questa consapevolezza, cioè il fatto che appunto qui si è distrutta la fede. E per ricostruire la fede ce ne vuole. Quindi,
certo, però devo anche, vabbè, ma poi magari ne parliamo. Devo anche dire che molte delle cose che tu racconti, che sono, diciamo così, gli ideali che hanno informato la tua infanzia, sarebbero, come dire...
Non così diversi.
Sì, no, cioè perfettamente traducibili nelle cose in cui anche noi credevamo, diciamo di sinistra, ecco. Scusate.
Ma sì, no, ma infatti, ma perché quella è appunto la fede dell'umanità. E come appunto nelle crociate c'era, cioè, come Gesù, dalla teoria di Gesù, del bene supremo, eccetera, eccetera, uno arriva alle crociate e dal comunismo uno arriva all'Unione Sovietica, a Stalin, eccetera. Cioè, e quella è la storia. Sì. Però appunto per quello che uno con la storia non è che guarda la storia e guarda dall'altra parte.
I know that Professor Nicoletti would like to intervene on the links between theology and political philosophy, but there's a question in the queue here, so if...
Non si possono aprire le finestre, vero?
So, I don't know, I have to speak in English or switch to Italian because
I think anarchy is the rule now, so you decide.
Okay, let's speak German.
She can answer.
No, sorry. I would like to go back to the little discussion you had on the social movements, and I'd like to pose this question to Lea Ypi, the Kantian. And I was thinking about the fact that if really your lecture on historical progress is of course really Kantian, and I think we can use this philosophy also to solve the problem, the question, when is the social movement progressist or when is it conservative and so on. Because in fact, Kant says progress is not really the French Revolution. The progress is the reaction of the German to the French Revolution, because see, in the French Revolution the Germans was able to have this moral feeling that is enthusiasm. So maybe we can say that, for example, it really is the first thing that's come to my mind, the Arabian upsprings are a sign of progress because there was an international solidarity with the women and men of the Arabian countries. Or, for example, let's think to the uprising of women in Iran. That's a sign of progress because there is an international solidarity, sorority in this case in particular. And another question, but it's more a curiosity, in fact. Always speaking of a social movement, what is your vision, if there is any, where you put in your theory, in your philosophy, for example, the environmental movements? Because it seems to me they do not really deal with the idea of justice you define in your text. It seems to me, but I might be wrong, of course. So if we see justice as the limitation of power, so claiming for environmental justice, and I'm not speaking of only economical progress, I see we are in another level, but I don't know, it's just a question, because as a Kantian, as I deal with environmental issues, it's always problematic, because in fact nature isn't really a point for Kant, only in the third critique, but yes, you know better than me. So what is your interpretation on this? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I think it's also one where one sees how important it is to engage with the environmental concerns and questions from the point of view of humanity. So the way I see it, it's, as Kant says, I think he's right, nature is neither good nor bad. Nature does, and this is in fact, as you mentioned in the third critique, this kind of turning point in his teleological thinking is when he goes from a position where he says nature helps us develop our moral dispositions to one where he says, no, it's actually only if we engage with nature from the point of view of our moral standpoint, then we see nature operating, that we ascribe a meaning to what goes on in nature. And so I think that's the point at which you realize that there is nothing to essentialize in nature. And again, and it's the same thing with the environment. I mean, why, I mean, maybe this is kind of extreme, but I don't think you want to save a world of bad people. So why should we just save the world or save nature? Or just, it depends on what kind of world you create. And it depends on how you engage with nature. So I think what is central there is the point of view of the human in relationship to nature. But what I think the environmental debate does is that it kind of makes us aware of conflicts that go beyond the conflicts that we have been accustomed to think about. So we've always thought of conflicts as, my family, my neighborhood, my city, my state, and this is something that forces you to engage not just with the world as a whole, but also with the world as a whole in temporal terms, as the world of future generations. And I think from that point of view, it's really important to recover actually the relationship, this kind of humanity standpoint, the moral standpoint on the environment and the human standpoint on the environment without conceding to what I think these kind of crazy environmental defenses of we just need to protect the stones and the water for its sake. I don't think there's anything to protect if there is no human perspective. So so I think it can go both ways, but it's really important to recover the way I see it, not this kind of sacrality of nature, but nature as mediated by humanity and by reasons and but by freedom ultimately, I think.
Thank you. So it's almost 8 o'clock, so this is the last call for any question, comment. No? So if there are no further questions, I would like to thank very much Lea and for her generous contribution. And Professor Guaraldo and all the people who contributed to the discussion by asking questions or just by listening. I promised you a rich contribution. I'm sorry, and I don't know what language I might speak now, and I think we got what I promised. So if you are satisfied, see you next week for Professor Honnet's public lecture, and for the master students and PhD students, tomorrow you will have a second opportunity to ask questions to Professor Ypi. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening.
Thank you.